had brought a book that I wanted to read a little bit from Sunday morning, and we ran out of time. Edersheim has a monumental work on the life of Christ, and he had a lot to say about some of the traditions of the Jews. And I wanted to read just a little bit of that, and didn't get to it, but maybe we'll do that tonight. Glad to see all of you. Really glad to see Brother Fair and Sister Sandra back with us, and have them back. They're not feeling the greatest, which is understandable, but I'm just glad to see their faces, and I know you are too. Josh texted me today, Josh Sanders. He's having some inner ear trouble, and he said if he's not here tonight, that would be the explanation of that. I don't know if we've gotten a flyer for a meeting, but supposed to be at Harpersville this Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Randy's uncle, Bruce Jones, is a member there. Brother Bruce was Sister Elizabeth's brother, youngest brother, wasn't it, Randy? Was it youngest? Not the youngest. Middle brother. But he just, from what I've been able to, in talking with him, he's a good man. But anyway, I won't be here with you Sunday, but Lord willing, be back Wednesday. So it's a brief meeting, and we'll be glad to be there, but be glad to be back with you also. Let me get my get our thing charged up here. Here we go. Okay, let's not go through our Bible readings tonight for time's sake, but we've got 2 or 3 of the minor prophets that we're reading through, and we'll try to pick up maybe whoever you're teaching, maybe Charlie can do a little bit of that. All right, we're studying the life of Christ. We want to remember the 4 accounts emphasize different aspects of Jesus' life. All 4 certainly have a lot of things that overlap, but there's a different emphasis of each. Matthew emphasizes that Jesus is the tie to the Old Testament, and also that he's the king of the what? What's emphasized in Matthew? The kingdom of heaven. And Mark it's a shorter account, more activity. What is emphasized? Miracles. Luke, a little longer, more human interest stories. What's emphasized? His humanity. And then the very first verse of John gives you the key. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. John's about his deity, right? And so when we just want to keep all that in mind, and then that kind of helps us, as we'll see even tonight, where in an account here where some of the Jewish practices are explained a little bit more in the book of Mark. Matthew writing primarily for a Jewish audience, Mark a Roman likely, Luke Hellenist, and John a Greek. If you can kind of think, if most conservative scholars are correct in assuming that John was written at the latter part of the 1st century, what monumental event had occurred that Matthew, Mark, and Luke had predicted? Who's thinking with me? What would it have been? Monumental event that occurred that was before John wrote. Destruction of Jerusalem. And so that can explain a few things in John. All right. So let's take it from the top, and we got with the years of preparation, then about 30, and Luke 1, Luke 2, Luke 3, birth of John, Jesus, early work of John. Then the beginning ministry, part 2, starts with his baptism, and just keep in mind that most about what we read about the beginning ministry occurs in the book of John. We have Matthew 3, Mark 1, Luke 3, and Luke 4, but primarily in the book of John. All right, so we have that in the beginning ministry, and Jesus goes up to Cana, turns water to wine, comes back, does what in the temple? Cleanses it. Interview with whom in chapter 3 of John? Nicodemus. With whom in 4? woman at the well. And then he goes north. He goes, the woman at the well was at Sychar, close to Samaria. Then he goes to Cana and heals the nobleman's son who was over in Capernaum. Goes to Nazareth and he's rejected. And they want to do what to him, Jen? Push him off the brow of the hill. Then he goes to Capernaum, makes it his own city. And then we have a lot of events happening there in this Galilean ministry. He calls 4 disciples. Who are they? Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Their occupation? They're fishers. They're fishers. They're fishermen. Right. And then he calls them and said, you follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. Then he teaches in the synagogue and casts out a demoniac. Peter's mother-in-law tours Galilee, heals a leper, and then a paralytic in Capernaum through letting down through the tile. Then he calls Matthew, whose occupation was tax collector. And then Matthew is so happy about everything that he calls some of his fellow tax collectors together with other sinners, and they give Jesus a what? A feast. And while they're feasting, John's disciples come along with some of the Pharisees and say, why are you feasting while we're fasting? And then then we don't know for certain how this would fit chronologically, but most put Jesus attending the feast and healing a lame man back in Jerusalem about this time, because there's a lot of controversy over his doing things on the Sabbath day. Right. And so this is where we were. He heals the man who has been afflicted with this difficulty for how many years? 38. And he's waiting on somebody to help him get into the pool of Bethesda. And people were getting in ahead of him. And so Jesus just says, would you like to be well? Well, I'll tell you what to do. Take up your bed and walk. And he did, and the Pharisees object. And so we have Jesus saying in summary form, my Father works until now, and I work. Oh, they shouldn't have said that according to the Pharisees, because they said not only did he violate the Sabbath, he also called God his own Father, making himself equal to God. So then we have, following that, the effect, well, that's in 17, 18, 19. And then his speech showing his relationship with the Father, his closeness, the love the Father had for him, the fact that what he saw and what he heard, those were the things he would do. So you have that close connection to the Father that he had. By the way, just things come to mind sometimes, and I didn't say this earlier. There is going to be a kind of a tie back to that idea in John 14, 15, and 16. When we get there, that'll be the night Jesus is betrayed. And he has this long discussion with his apostles over about 4 or 5 ideas. They're upset that he's saying he's going to have to be killed. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also. And then he goes on to talk about, the fact that he would be persecuted. However, they'll persecute you also. But the Spirit is going to be with you, and he'll bring to your remembrance all that you said. And yet he says, if I'm the vine and you're the branch, and if you abide in me and I in you, then everything's going to be okay, because we're all related then to the Father. And it's interesting that how in all of this in John 5, he makes that connection to the Father back, just as the Father is honored, so I must be. As I see the Father, so am I. And so as that close connection that he had to the Father. And then the witnesses of his deity, we went over that Sunday morning. And I wanted to come back down, that's too far. Let's see. I guess that's it. I went over this, I believe, Sunday morning. Didn't I? Did you remember this chart? I know there was something that I didn't go over. Well, let's go over real quickly and we'll move on. Additional lessons besides what we see just developed or devolving from the text was certainly Jesus' compassion on those who were sick, his power over every area of human experience, just different areas of sicknesses. His miracles were not intended to make everyone who ever had problems well. There was a divine selection. And the man who was healed had no faith. He didn't even know who healed him at the beginning. And then Jesus identified himself there in the temple precinct a little bit later. Jesus anticipated greater works that he would do. The resurrection, both from spiritual death he mentions first, as well as physical death, and then the judgment that God had given into his hands. And the unity of the Bible story points to his deity and to the apex of the story, the proofs that he offered. I think I mentioned that in passing, but it's all, if you just think about a line, a linear kind of argument that goes from the beginning of the story on, that's what we have. We showed you that couldn't have, no way that could have just been thrown together. All right, so we move on to where we are now. And if you'll notice on the next page, page 46 of your booklets, Jesus' disciples plucked grain on the Sabbath. And this has been a passage that has given rise to some questions that I think are not all that difficult to answer, but I think some have taken maybe I would consider at least a different point than I take. Let's read all three accounts here. Matthew 12 is the most exhaustive account of it. Mark and Luke's account are a little shorter. Let's start. Patty, we hadn't started with you in a while. Why don't you just read the whole 12, 1 through 8. I may interrupt you a time or two, but go ahead and start. Yes, thank you, Patty. They take issue with Jesus that his disciples had violated the Sabbath by taking these ears that they had plucked and begin to eat them. Some of your translations may say the word corn. Most of the newer translations have grain. Could have been wheat or barley. I was thinking about how you'd illustrate this. From what I've understood, when the King James translators translated in early 1600s, that the word corn is, when we say the word Coke, C-O-K-E, that could be a Pepsi, it could be a Dr. Pepper, it could be a Sprite. We say it's just a lot of people just use that one term to designate any carbonated beverage. And likewise, the word corn was sometimes used just to describe any kind of grain that you could pluck and eat. But whatever kind it was, in one sense, it's immaterial. Whatever it was pluckable, it was edible, and and the day that they did it, as they happened to be going through, was a Sabbath. One other quick idea on this, and that is at that season or at that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day. It could very well have been, if our chronology is correct, that they're going back from Jerusalem, as I have on the chart here, up into Galilee. And at some place up in this region, we don't know where. We don't know if it were right around Capernaum or not, but there were shocks of grain that they were able to pluck. So they did. When the Pharisees saw it, they complained to Jesus that his disciples were doing what was not lawful on the Sabbath. Jesus gives a couple of illustrations. have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, the 400 men who were soldiers along with David? This was when David was running from whom? Saul. The account that is mentioned here is 1 Samuel 21. David had fled to the little city of Nob, and there was a priest by the name of Ahimelech there. And Ahimelech, David comes up to him and says, we're hungry. We've been on the lam. We've been running from Saul. And he said, I don't have anything here but what? The showbread. But the problem was who only were to eat the showbread off the table inside the temple, the tabernacle. Only the priest. And here's a case where Kirsten, some of the young people and I were talking the other night about the idea when the Bible specifies something and it doesn't say anything else in that realm, then all you have authority for is what God has specified. Like in Hebrews 7, he speaks of Christ being a priest after the order of Melchizedek, but only those from the tribe of Levi could function as priests. So that meant what had to happen to the law in order for Jesus to become our high priest? It had to be changed, because he says, for no man hath given attendance at the altar from any tribe but Levi. Now he didn't say you couldn't, but when he specified the tribe of Levi, that eliminated everything else. Now, in a similar way, this passage that goes back to Leviticus 25, it is the same way. He just specified that the priests were to eat it. He didn't say, well, he didn't say all the other people couldn't, but when he specified a particular group of people, what did that do to everybody else? It eliminated. Sometimes we call that a law of silence in establishing Bible authority. If there is an area that God has been specific on, then it eliminates everything else. You take, for instance, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but an elder is to be the husband of one wife. The husband. Well, what does that obviously eliminate? If you've got to be the husband of one wife, it automatically eliminates what sex can't be. The women or single men. Yeah, it eliminates that by specifying what he wants. So anyway, I thought I would bring that out on that. So what David and his men did, was it actually according to the Mosaic law, or was it not? It was not. It was unlawful. What was that, sweetie? It was not according to the law. In fact, he says that. Verse 3, have you not read that David, when he was hungry, they that were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which it was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them that were with him, but only for the priest. So that's the first thing. Now, we don't know exactly why he says that here, but if you put it all in the context, the Jews did not condemn David and his men, and yet on that occasion they were doing something that was unlawful. And here are Jesus and his men, so to speak, Jesus and his disciples, and are they doing what is unlawful by just taking some grain, pods of grain? No, not at all. And so Jesus is showing their hypocrisy. Well, he gives a second illustration here in verse 5. Have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath day the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? Now, let's stop on that one for just a moment. The priest profane, what do your translations have for that? What is it? Break, yeah, same idea. Desecrate, that's a word that's sometimes used. But now, question, had the law actually specified for the priest to do certain things on the Sabbath day? Yes. Okay, so let's back up a second. Here you have a general law, the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. That's a general law. But at the same time God gave a general law, he gave some specifics over here relative to what priests were to do. Well, what they were to do were what we would call exceptions to the general rule. You follow that? I'll give you a prime example. Luke 16, verse 18. Whosoever shall put away his wife and marrieth another commits adultery. And whosoever marries her that is put away commits adultery. That's the general rule. If there's anybody who's married, divorced, and remarried, they're in adultery. You know where I'm going, don't you? One exception. What is that? Matthew 19:9, 532. What is it? Brother Gene, you were about to say it? Or Sister Jamie? What was it? For fornication. Whosoever shall put away his wife except for fornication and marries another commits adultery. So you have a general rule, but an exception to it. Go back to the law. Here you have the general rule, remember the Sabbath. Here's some exceptions that the priests were. But according to the traditions of the Pharisees, what the priests were doing were actually doing what? Right or wrong? That wrong, yeah. According to the traditions of the Pharisees, if you just left the law by itself and just worked on their traditions, then they were violating it. So look at it again in verse 5. Have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath day the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? They simply profane it from the point of view of the traditions of the Pharisees, or the traditions of the elders. But I say unto you that one greater than the temple is here. Of whom does he speak? Of himself. That's right. And so here is, let's keep reading. But if ye had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless. Well, who are the guiltless here? Who are they condemning who are guiltless? His own disciples. That's right. And so if you had known what this meant, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Have we seen that passage used before? Yes. It was used before, and it'll be used again from Hosea 6, verse 6. So in other words, you're not looking on this whole thing with any mercy. It's not that we're violating law. It's that you're not giving us the benefit of the doubt that we're even keeping the Sabbath. We're just violating your traditions. But he says, if you had known what that meant, you would not have condemned the guiltless. We are actually guiltless. We don't have any guilt. And then he takes it completely out of the realm of interpretation. He says, for the Son of Man is what? Lord of the Sabbath. He's Lord of the Sabbath, which basically means what? He's had authority over it. What was that, David? He made it. Yeah. All of that together is obviously right. Jesus puts himself on a co-authorship with God that, I'm responsible for this law. I'm over this law. If anyone knows what the interpretation of the law is, I do, Jesus is saying. And so he removes it from a matter of interpretation to a matter of authority. I'm Lord of this thing. I know what I'm talking about. And so he removes it from there. And all right, any comment or question? Anybody? Oh yeah, they were. Can't you hear them? We are so glad you enlightened us on this matter. All right, let's go to Mark 3. Mark, the 3rd chapter. Mark 2, 23 through the end. It's right at the end of Mark 2. David, would you read that for us? Mark 2, 23 through the end. Yes, now this little phrase is interesting, the middle part of 27. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, they had made all their restrictions about it, but the truth of the matter was, God had made the Sabbath for man's what? For his good, for his rest, for his reflection on what God had done. not to be made out of what the Pharisees were made of. So the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then he comes back with the refrain, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. All right? One other quick thing. In verse 26, David read how he entered into the house of God when Abiathar was high priest. If you look back in 1 Samuel 21, it's not Abiathar, it's I mentioned him a moment ago, Ahimelech. It's Ahimelech. However, Ahimelech was the father of Abiathar. And Abiathar was the priest that traveled around all the time with David. And so so he was with Ahimelech, his father, during this time, but Abiathar was actually, we might say, the de jure high priest with, that is, Ahimelech was, and Abiathar was in the wings, so to speak, waiting. And then he would be the priest during the time of David. And so when it says during the days of Abiathar, well, he was not necessarily acting, but he was with Ahimelech. Sometimes if anybody wants to pick at you about any Bible, any discrepancy, and they'll use that, then that is the answer to that. It's during the days, or when Abiathar, you might have a marginal reading that says in the days or during the time of Abiathar. Okay, all right, let's go to Luke's account. Paula, if you would, Luke 6 through 11, please. Right. You know what, Paula? I blew it. I'm just reading right along, thinking it should be 6:1 through 5 instead of 6 through 11. I'm sorry. All right, thank you. All right, let's answer some of our questions, and I want to show a couple things on the charts behind me. On page 46, mentioned in the note, keep in mind that since there was no break in Matthew, Mark, or Luke concerning the time we just studied, when Jesus was in Jerusalem, we place it where we did because of the similar conflicts he underwent over the supposed Sabbath violations. Always remember when we read something like, and the Waldrons had several great paragraphs in the book about that. When the statement is made, you know, why do you and your disciples transgress the Sabbath? Did Jesus actually ever transgress anything? No. Keep in mind that little statement in 1 Peter 2. That he did no sin, neither was gall found in his mouth. Jesus never committed one sin. He always acted exactly as the law stipulated. So whatever a person's thinking is on a passage, it has to square with that overall idea that Jesus never did anything wrong, and he always kept the law. So whatever is said otherwise has to be some construction of his enemies. Okay, number one, why did Jesus' disciples pluck ears to eat? They were hungry. Note the actual law on this matter in Deuteronomy 23. If a Jew went into a neighbor's vineyard He could eat a sufficient amount to be filled, but he was not to put any in a vessel. In other words, you weren't just to, take a bucket and pack up and carry home and eat for several days, but in a need you could do that. Further, if one went into a neighbor's grain field, he could pluck the ears, but he was not to do what? And use a sickle. We'd say he was not to harvest it, not take it for himself. Were the disciples actually violating the law on that particular matter? No, not at all. And I mentioned in the note, the Pharisees' traditions had blinded them to the simplicity of the law of Moses on a number of things, and in fact were causing them to transgress God's law in order to keep their traditions, as we will later see. Notice the following from the Talmud, and we talked about that last week, the Jewish comments and applications of law which had been derived from their traditions. And here's a statement from Edersheim. In case a woman rolls wheat to remove the husks, it's considered sifting. If she rubs the heads of wheat, it's regarded as threshing. If she cleans off the side adherences, it's sifting out fruit. If she bruises the ears, it's grinding. If she throws them up in her hand, it's winnowing. So they took everything and just exacerbated it, just took, just amplified, I guess is a better word. And the law never, basically the law was saying, let's don't go out and harvest something. Now, if you have something, you rub it together and you eat it, that's not a violation of law. And obviously Jesus' disciples saw that. So, number 4, to what Old Testament incident did Jesus refer them to show their hypocrisy? David and his men at Nob eating what? The showbread. All right. Did Jesus say this man, that is David, was innocent or guilty? No, he was guilty. Yeah. They did that which was unlawful to do because it was only for the priest to eat. The irony of this is that the Pharisees considered what David did what? Justifiable or lawful, when it was actually sinful or unlawful. And yet at the same time considered Jesus' disciples doing that which was unlawful when it was actually lawful or justifiable. And hence, see, they were giving a benefit of the doubt to David and his men when actually they were violating the law. And here are Jesus and his disciples, and they're not giving them any benefit of the doubt, but they're doing right. They just happen to be violating the traditions. And so he says, you need to go learn what this passage means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. He was showing their hypocrisy and how they were condemning innocent people and yet justifying people who were guilty. And I've got another point on that as well. I mentioned in the note under 6, only priests were to eat showbread, Leviticus 24. However, David had eaten showbread when it was not lawful, 1 Samuel 21:6. He sought to justify his actions based on the fact that he and his men were hungry. Though a need existed, David and his men violated the law. On the other hand, Jesus' disciples were likewise hungry, plucked ears of grain on the Sabbath. However, the difference was that they did not violate Sabbath law, but violated the traditions of the Pharisees. Jesus shows their hypocrisy by their justification of David when he violated Moses' law, and the condemnation of him and his disciples for violating not the law but their traditions. All right, 7. Jesus called their attention to Hosea 6:6, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and applied it to them. If they had known what the passage meant, they would not have done what? Condemned the guiltless. That's right. And I had in this note, I just sharing with you what I find just amazing. Jesus' use of this passage is fascinating. The context of Hosea 6 shows that the Jews of his days were hypocritical, thinking their sacrifices were sufficient to hide their immorality and sins. Any good ever done on their part rapidly passed. It was like the dew of the morning, he said, like a cloud in the sky. It was not wholehearted service to God, but sham and hypocrisy even by the priest. If we read all of Hosea 6, I'm sure you did. Hosea 6:6 does not teach that God was not interested in sacrifice, but that sacrifice was useless and vain if not accompanied by mercy and righteous living. That's the same thing today, going through eating the Lord's Supper and doing the specific things that we're to do. If it's not accompanied by a sincere life, a holy life, it's useless. Jesus applied all those principles in one swipe as he condemned the Pharisees with that one reference. You need to go learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Well, they would have known exactly where Jesus was talking about. They probably had it underlined in their scrolls. And just think, Jesus is putting them, these religious leaders, in the same boat with the hypocrite, their ancestral hypocrites, who just thought that they could throw God a bone and everything's okay, and he'll bless them, and as long as they give their sacrifices, everything's hunky-dory. And Jesus put them in the same category with those people. Number 8, what does Jesus assert is his? And I should have had, instead of verse 8, Matthew 12:8, so it would take it out of the realm of wondering, but you probably knew anyway. What does he assert is his? He's the Sabbath. Yeah, he's Lord of the Sabbath, right. And so he removes it from a question of interpretation to a question of authority. Explain what that means in its context. Well, we've already done that. If anyone knew what? If anyone knew what was right Sabbath law, it was Jesus. He was the one who he and God put it there. And in the note I mentioned, God gave law concerning what should and should not be done on the Sabbath. If anyone knew what was lawful, Jesus did. As the lawgiver is greater than the law, so Christ is greater than the Sabbath, knowing its intent, its requirements, and prohibition. With that statement, he made a claim for his deity. He's the Lord who had given Sabbath law hundreds of years before. Now, sometimes there are folks who will take this statement, go learn what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And what brethren sometimes will say is that what David and his men did was unlawful, but it was okay given the necessity that they were hungry. Likewise, they say what Jesus and his disciples were doing was violating the Sabbath, but it was okay because they were hungry. And then they come back to this the Jesus passage and said, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. See, in times of necessity, God allows these things. Y'all see? And then they'll say, well, what about the ox in the ditch? Well, that's what Jesus gets to in the next paragraph. What about the ox is it wrong to take an ox out of the ditch on the Sabbath? See, it's not wrong to do that. And people say, well, yeah, it's wrong to do that, but if necessity lends you to do that, it's okay. No, that's the wrong premise to start. It's okay to do that. And Jesus makes that point when he goes into the synagogue on the next Sabbath day or another Sabbath day, and he asked the people with the man who had the right hand who's withered, he said, is it lawful to do good and to heal on the Sabbath or not? Well, they couldn't answer that because in their own practices, they knew it was all right to rescue an ox out of the ditch or a sheep. So Jesus made the point, you've elevated the importance of a sheep over a man. And that's not right. So the point is not, I want to really emphasize this, guys, the point is not what I've heard some brethren say, that, yeah, Jesus and his disciples did wrong, but it was okay because they were hungry. And David and his men did wrong, but it was okay because they were... No, that's not right. David and his men were wrong, period. Jesus and his men were right, period. But they were wrong insofar as the Pharisees' ideas of... Does that make sense to everybody? That makes sense? That's what I was telling you about. I really wanted to emphasize the other day. Okay. Brother McGarvey, in his little book on Matthew and Mark, it's not the fourfold gospel, but he makes a great statement along these lines. I know you probably can't read it, but I'm going to read it for you. There's no doubt that on this ground, David excused himself for eating the showbread and that the Pharisees did the same for him. But it cannot be that he who refused to turn stones into bread when tortured by a 40-day fast, and who said, whosoever shall break one of these least commandments and teach men so, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven, would approve such a violation of law as David was guilty of. Neither can it be allowed neither can it be that he allowed his own disciples while under the law to break the Sabbath. If Christians may violate law, here's the part that I really wanted to emphasize. I thought McGarvey said it so well. If Christians may violate law when its observance would involve hardship or suffering, then there is an end of suffering for the name of Christ, and an end even of self-denial. But it is clear that by the Pharisees, David's act was thought excusable. Otherwise, they could have retorted on Jesus, thus, out of your own mouth we condemn you. You class your act with David's. But David sinned, and so do you. Now, the real argument of Jesus is this. David, when hungry, ate the showbread, which it was confessedly unlawful for him to eat, yet you justify him. My disciples pluck grain and eat it on the Sabbath, an act which the law does not forbid, and yet you condemn them. The priests in the temple were required to offer sacrifice, trim the golden lamps, burn incense on the Sabbath, and these acts required manual labor. In this case, the general law against labor on the Sabbath was modified by the specific law concerning the temple service. So that's how you get the word profane the Sabbath. The term profane is used not because it was a real profanation, but because being labor, it had the appearance of profanation. It had the appearance, and it was in their estimate, of what the Sabbath law was all about. The example proves that the prohibition of labor on the Sabbath was not universal. It might not include what the disciples just done. All right. 2 or 3 ideas on this real quick. The Pharisees continue their hostility toward Jesus. We see that here. Again, McGarvey in the Fourfold Gospel said every slightest act of his was submitted to a microscopic scrutiny. I thought that was great. A microscopic scrutiny, written that in the 1800s. Jesus' sinlessness in the smallest details. He did no sin, even in the smallest details. The divine wisdom seen in Jesus' use of the Old Testament in parallel of his own activities to David and his disciples' activities to the priest. He said it greater than the temple is here. If you think about here, the temple and the priest doing work around the temple on the Sabbath day that did not violate anything. Here's the temple and the priest. Here's Jesus and the disciples. So if you just imagine it, the temple and the priest, Jesus and the disciples. So, and then Jesus says, a greater than the temple is here. Y'all see that? So you got that parallel on both sides there. Jesus' denunciation of the Pharisees as hypocrites, a reflection of their ancestors as well as misunderstanding of the intent of the Sabbath. It does not justify a commonly thought idea of perceived necessity or inconvenience taking precedence over divine law. We just went in detail on that. His claim to deity, a greater than the temple is here, and then his claim to being Lord of the Sabbath is equivalent to co-authorship of the law with God the Father. None of that's in your notes. So, all right, comment or question? Anybody? David, you look like you wanted to say something. Anybody? Yes, sir, Brother Farron. And it's the same thing. It's wrong. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
I was thinking about going back to when Stephen was some of their history, their ancestors, and how they got mad at him and stoned him.
Yeah.
And they're doing the same thing.
Same thing. Yeah. Same thing. They, instead of saying, guys, I really hadn't thought of it that way. Let me give me a minute to think about it. They didn't do that. They just, he's putting, as Brother Gene mentioned the other day, he's about to take our place, our status away. We can't do that, regardless of the truth that he's speaking.
I think about Jesus knowing what they're going to say
before they even say it. Yes. Yes. And a right passage in the Old Testament to prove it. All right.
And he doesn't back down and say it.
No. Exactly right. And it's interesting where we'll get to Sunday with the man with the withered hand. He's going to call attention to the difference. Why don't you stand out here, young man? And he does. And then he asks the people, he says, is it good? Is it a violation of the Sabbath to do good? to do harm. Tell me about that. Of course, they observe the Passover then, don't they? They don't answer. But